Hello. In this video, we're going to go over some of the built-in data structures that are used and sort of built into included in the JavaScript programming language. All right. So the first basic data structure that JavaScript includes are arrays. So a JavaScript array is a sequence of values. It's very similar to an array in Java. It's very similar to a list in Python. It's actually closer to lists in Python than it is to arrays in Java. Unlike arrays in Java, however, arrays in JavaScript are much easier to work with, and they're much more pleasant to engage with. They don't have nearly the kinds of syntactical restrictions or problems or requirements that you'll see in Java. All right. In JavaScript, we declare arrays by using a literal syntax. So we write out the array using square brackets, and then we just list out the contents of that array by using a comma-separated list. So if I wanted to make an array of letters, I would simply write out bracket, first value, a letter, second value, a letter, third value, a letter, etc. This is our standard literal syntax. So again, I'll just copy and paste what this looks like. This is create a new letters array. Note that I'm naming my variable using the word array to indicate that letters is an array and not just a string of letters. And that creates our array. If I console log out what our letters array then looks like in the developer tools, the Chrome developer tools will list it out. This is an array that has three things, right? It'll draw it out as the angle brackets and put my list of things inside of it. It puts a 3 in front here, indicating there are 3 elements in this array. That's how big it is. If I click the little arrow next to it, I can actually drop it down in order to see that the value at index 0 is the A, the value at index 1 is a B, the value at index 2 is a C, my length is 3, and then ignore everything about prototype stuff. It's totally not relevant for anything we're doing in this class. And that's how we can be able to see some more details about what this array looks like. So that's our basic literal syntax. We don't need to declare array and then fill it like you do in Java. You don't need to declare a type for the array. You just say, here is my list of things that I include. It's much similar to how we did make lists in Python. Unlike in Java, JavaScript arrays can actually contain mixed data types. They can contain whatever data types we want. So I can have an array that contains a string, a number, a Boolean, and even another array inside of it all at once. This is valid code. In practice, we don't do this. Generally, if you're making an array, it's going to be an array of elements of the same type, right? It's a list of the same thing. We're not going to put a whole bunch of random stuff together into a single list. You can, it's just not very common or not very meaningful. So most commonly, arrays are going to be arrays of the same thing because that's why we want to have a list. It's a list of the collect of similar items, similar things. I'll also note that you can create empty arrays. So you can make an array that has no contents inside of it just by writing the brackets and not writing out any variables in the middle. We just make an array that has no values. This is called an empty array. It is perfectly valid. It is an array. It has a length of 0. Its contents are empty, and that's fine. But every other sense, it is an array, and you can work with it any way you'd work with any other array. Okay, similar to Java and Python, we access elements of an array by using bracket notation. So what we're going to do is we're going to write out the name of the array, followed by a pair of brackets. And then inside the brackets, we put the index, the room number of where we want to access the element of that array. So for example, if I want to get the 0th element of the array, so I can take my letters array and say, let's access the whatever value lives at room number 0, whoever lives at index 0, and I can console log that out. It'll console.log out. It'll log out the A because that's the person who lives at who lives in room 0, who's at index 0. If I try to console log the element at index 4, index 0, noting there that arrays like in Python and Java, but not like in R, are 0 indexed. So 0 is the A, 1 is the B, 2 is the C. Right, 1 will be B, and 2 will be C. If I try to access the element at index 4, now there is no element at index 4, right? There's index 0, 1, and 2. 4, right out. I mean, not even 3. 4 is right out. If I ask what element lives at index 4, JavaScript will tell me the element that lives at index 4 is undefined. Which is brilliant, right? That's true. The value at index 4 is undefined because we have not defined a value who lives at index 4. JavaScript will not create errors. There's no array index out of bounds exceptions. There's no bounding errors with arrays. We just say either it's in the array or it's not. And if I say who lives at room 4, well, no one lives at room 4 because I never said who lives at room 4. I've said who lives at rooms 0, 1, and 2. I've never said who lives at 1, 4. So therefore, the person who lives at index 4 is undefined. And again, there's that keyword undefined, that special value that means something, that has this meaning of there's nothing there. Again, it's one of my favorite parts of JavaScript because it says exactly what it means, right? Who lives at 4? It's undefined. I don't know. No one. Not there. Okay. Similarly, because arrays have no index bounds that we really care about, they aren't enforced anyway, it means we can grow the array by adding different elements at different bounds. So we can assign and modify arrays just like we would in Java or JavaScript, right? Again, we can assign a value to a particular index of the array. So I can, for example, I don't know an example on the slide, but we'll do it here. I could, for example, go to my letters array and we could say, go to the value at index 0, and let's assign a capital A to that spot in the array. Right? We're going to change who is in that array. We're going to assign a new value to this room number. And again, it's the exact same way you did it in Python or Java or R. Any other way. We then log out our arrays index, letters index, excuse me, letters array. Thank you. There we go. You'll now see there's now a capital A in that array instead. If I try to go to my letters array and I try to assign a value at index 5, which again is not inside the bounds, right? The array is 0, 1, 2. If I say go to index 5 and let's put a letter there, like F, and then if I console log my array, you'll notice that what it does is it takes my array, which has the A, which I made capitalized, B, C, 2 empty slots, right? So as index 0A, 1, 2, spots 3 and 4 are empty. They are undefined. There's no values there. And then index 5, we now have an F. So what we've done is we've increased the size of our array. Our array has grown. It now has 6 elements instead of 3 just by assigning something further down the list. We've said go to this extra room and all the sort of other rooms along the way get created. Unlike Java, we don't need to worry about how big the array was to begin with, or we don't have to resize it or ever. It's more like an array list in that sense where it grows and shrinks and adjusts based on what contents are in there. Because it's not really about the size, it's about what elements live at what locations, at what indices. And again, if we expand this out, Chrome will only list A, B, C, and F. But again, the person who lives at index 4, right, if I say after I've grown my array, who now lives at index 4, the person who lives at index 4 is still undefined. Chrome writes out as it being empty, but the values there are undefined. There are 2 undefineds, undefined at index 4, 3, and at index 4. Okay. We can access if we want to actually access this number, we want to say how many elements are in this array, 6. We can use the .length property. So we would talk about letters array .length. This is again similar to what you do in Java. There's no len function like there is in Python. Note that this gives us a value of 6, right? If we say how many values are in this array, the value is 6, even though 2 of those values are undefined. What JavaScript does is actually when it's calculating the length of an array is it goes to sort of the last index and says that guy plus 1 is how many spots are filled in the array. Even though some of them might have undefined as their value, they're still considered part of the array. So this has 6 elements, even though there's actually only 4 letters and 2 undefined along the way. Okay. Finally, arrays have methods as well that we can use. So if I have my letters array, and I want to push a value into it. So letters array supports a push method. Push will add whatever value indicate in the middle up sort of to the end of the array without necessarily having to care about what spot you're putting it in. You can just say put it at the end. And I can do that. I'll figure out what my letters array is after that then I can then add Z to the end of my array. Arrays have lots and lots have a number of different methods. You'll learn a couple of them sort of as we go through the class, and as you work through problems and exercises, you'll be able to you'll encounter some of these methods as they go. You can also then look them up in the JavaScript documentation. But this is where we sort of go to, that's sort of the other ways we can interact with arrays. Cool. Let's see. I'm moving through this fairly quickly because arrays are going to be really similar to data structures you're already familiar with. I'm trying to highlight on what sort of the key ideas and the key variations that you'll have to worry about if you're coming from these other languages. Okay. So here's a moment. If you want to take a moment to practice and sort of just make sure you're able to write out what an array is, because getting practice with the muscle memory and learning how to type things out, you can take a moment to maybe try on yourself, writing an array that maybe includes 3 strings, your name, and maybe the names of 2 friends. Log out the array, make sure you're able to do that. You're welcome to pause this video and try that out. I'm going to keep going. So arrays can contain any data type, as I mentioned, and this includes other arrays, which is actually really, really common in JavaScript. In JavaScript, we tend to nest data structures. We tend to have data structures that contain more data structures that contain more data structures in order to represent complex data schemas. And that's the thing that we actually do quite a lot in web programming and JavaScript programming in particular, or JavaScript programming web in particular. So just as a review, as an example of what a nested array looks like, right? A nested array would be an array. So in this case, I have an array called dinner options, and each dinner option as array has four. So my dinner options array has four values inside of it, each of which themselves is an array of different things to eat. So we say there's four options, and each one has three things inside of that option. So what I can then do is if I say, okay, how many things are inside dinner options? There's four, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 dinner values in dinner options. If I go to the value at index 2, so there's index 1, index 2, 0, index 0, index 1, here's index 2. The value at dinner options index 2 is an array, right? That's my fish option array, which contains my fish, my rice, and my green beans. Because that's an array, I can access its elements by their using bracket notation, right? I can say go to the 0th element of my fish option, right? So this is an array. Go to its 0th element is the fish. And of course, because fish option is really just dinner options 2, effectively I can replace that in the code. I can almost do a copy and find replace kind of behavior. So what I can do is I can actually say, go to my dinner options, go to index 2, the fish option, and from there go to index 0, the fish. So what I can do is I can use this sequence set of bracket notation in order to be able to access elements inside of lists that are inside arrays that are inside of other arrays. This is not R's double bracket notation. This is a sort of sequence of bracket notations where effectively I'm doing is I'm using this sort of anonymous value, this sort of like I'm not assigning that to a variable, I'm sort of using that directly and then saying, get me the next piece that comes after that. We do this a lot in JavaScript because, again, we have these nested data structures, so we're often going to have sequences of brackets. That's a pretty common thing to see when we're doing JavaScript work. Okay. The other data structure that JavaScript uses a lot, even more than arrays, are what are called objects. So an object is an unordered set of key value pairs. It's very similar to a map or a hash map in Java. So if you remember hash maps, that's very similar in concept, right? They're keys that then associate with values. If you've used lists in R, it's the same idea there, right? You have a key, a label that's associated with some value. If you use a dictionary in Python, this is practically the exact same thing, and the syntax looks the same, right? Where you have keys that are then associated with values. So these key value pairs, the idea is that we're going to use that key, that word, to sort of look up, to refer to, or to label some particular value, similar to how a dictionary works, right? We've got sort of the word and the definition thereof. The key is used to look up that value. Objects are also more technically what's not called an associative array, where it's associating one data type with another data type, but that's kind of a little bit beyond what we're dealing with. Roughly, if you think of nothing else, right? An object is just a special kind of an array, but instead of the indices being numbers, where I have index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, my indices are strings. So I don't have the 0th, 1th, 2th, 3th element. I have the Bobbeth, Charleseth, Emmethith, Zangthith, right? I have the dogeth, the cateth, the sort of some string representing what that value is. All right, so how does this work? Let me delete my array stuff. So we can ignore the arrays for a moment. So we declare objects using a literal syntax, just like we declare arrays using a literal syntax. So I could, for example, create my ages object here. And my ages object is we rate objects using curly braces. So square brackets are arrays, curly braces are objects. We write curly braces. We're then going to put the key as a string in quotes, followed by a colon, followed by the value associated with that key. So in this case, this is saying that the key Sarah refers to the value 42, the key Amit refers to the value 35, and the key Zong refers to the value of 13, right? We're sort of this, semantically, the intention here is that here's a person and here's their ages. Here's their age that we go through up. If we console log out this object, right, our object lists out Sarah 42, Amit 35, Zong 13. If I expand that out, it lists out Amit 35, Sarah 42, Zong 13. Notice that when I expand it and I use the little arrow here, the order changes. That's because there is no order. Objects are unordered sets. There's no first, second, or third thing in the object, right? They're just like a bag of values that have labels on them. So we don't say that the Sarah key is first. It's just that this object contains the Sarah key. So you can't talk about the first or second or third value of an object because objects don't have any kind of order. That doesn't exist, really. So there's no real order here. So in this case, Google is just listing it out, or Chrome is just listing out alphabetically order because they're strings. Okay. Data types can be, the values can be anything we want. So again, here's a value where it has one key, an int, that refers to an integer, a key, a string, that refers to a string, a key, an array, that refers to an array. So the value types can be any type that we want. They can be, you can be mixed types, right? You can include strings, numbers, values, arrays, other objects, anything we're interested in. That said, the keys are always strings. So unlike in Python or where you can have dictionaries that can have other hashable values for keys, or in Java hash maps where you can have any kind of data type as a key, in JavaScript, the keys are always strings. Even if you write out something that doesn't look like a string, JavaScript will coerce it into being a string in order to make it work. The keys and objects are always strings. And of course, we can have an empty object, similar to an empty array, just has no values inside of it. Now, these keys are always strings. And because these keys are always strings, we actually can use a syntactic shortcut when writing them out, when writing the literals, and just leave off the quotes. Because JavaScript knows that anything before that comma has to be a string. So putting the quotes around to say it's a string is kind of redundant because it has to be a string. So what you'll find is that in JavaScript, we can actually remove the quotes from our keys, and it also works exactly the same. And in fact, you'll notice that's why Chrome, when it outputs this object, is not putting quotes around these strings, because the quotes are sort of, they're not required as part of defining a literal value. Now, of course, if your key had an actual space in it, then you would have to put quotes around it in order to sort of, to enforce the fact that it's now a legal variable name. But we can skip these pieces together in order to be able, we don't have to include the quotes in order to define our objects. That said, they're still actually strings. So if I defined a object here that is my number of words, right? So this is going to be saying where the keys are a numeral value and the value is the word itself, right? In this case, I'm writing out the keys as 1, 2, 3. And if I console log it, right, it writes out 1, 2, 3, same way. But those keys themselves are actually strings. And you can see that if we use a built-in function. So JavaScript includes a built-in function called object with capital O, so referring to the object module, the object class, effectively, similar to like math.square root. It's the same kind of concept here. There's a keys function that belongs to the object class, similar to how there's a round function that belongs to the math class, for example. So the object data value has a keys function. The keys function, if we pass in the number of words, object, right? Because this is my number, this is an object. Here, I'll relabel that to make it clear. Object, right? What this returns then is a key array. So it returns an array of all the keys. And if I console.log that key array, I call this the autocomplete is fitting it in. Right, you'll notice that my array, my keys are strings, the 1 key, the 2 key, the 3 key string. That said, because strings and numbers can be coerced into one another, like that distinction often gets lost and you can really treat them as if they were numbers, but they are in fact strings along the way. So if you try to add one to them, try to add something to them, it will concatenate them. It won't add them the way you might expect. Because again, there's no order. Right? We don't actually have a 1, 2, 3 element. We just have keys that are strings that represent that. Whew, okay. All right. So once we have our data structure, we can access the individual values of that data structure by using bracket notation, the exact same way we do with an array, or the same way you might do with a list with a dict in Python. So if I have my ages object here, here's a different one. My ages object has different people in this example. That's fine. I can look up those values by putting the key inside of the brackets. So I could say, go to my ages object, right, brackets, and go look for the Alice value. This is just like when we had an array. I might say, go look for the 1th value or the 0th value. In this case, I'm saying look for the Alice value. The Alice value is 40, so then for that value, we'll return 40. The Bob value is 35. The Charles value is 13. Now, just like with an array, I didn't delete the array stuff. Just like with an array, if I try to access a value that isn't there, we don't get an error. So if I take my ages, if I try to console log and go to my ages object here, and I try to get the value for Fred, and I say, what's Fred's age? Right? The result I get back is undefined. We don't get an error, just like with arrays, when we try to act something out of bounds, we didn't get an error. We don't get an error that says that there's no Fred key. We just say, what's the value at the Fred key? It's undefined. There is no value defined at the Fred key. There's no problem saying that the object doesn't have a Fred key, because objects don't, it's not that an object has a key or doesn't have a key. It's that the object has values, and those values may or not be keyed. So there's no number whose key is Fred. If you think of it that way, rather than thinking about sort of object has these keys, think about, does the object have values that are keyed that way? It makes things work a little bit more smoothly. Cool. So that becomes undefined. Similarly, we can assign values to keys, right? So I can say, go to Alice and give Alice an age of 41, right? Alice can go ahead. Oh, she's already 42. We don't have Alice here, right? So if I can say, go to ages object, and we can go to Sarah, and we can say, I want my Sarah to become 43. She's going to, happy birthday, Sarah. If we then console log my ages object again, right? Sarah's age is now 43. We've now taken the 43. We've assigned it to the Sarah key inside that object. The other thing is, again, because it's not that objects have or don't have keys, they have values, is that we can assign a new value into an object and give it a key that may not have been previously assigned to a value in that object. So if I, for example, said, I want to take the number 19 and I want to assign it to some value in my ages object, and the value I want to associate it to, the key I want to assign it to, is the key Fred, I can do that. What that's going to do is that's going to say the ages object's Fred key will now refer to the value 19. And if I console log my ages object again, now there is a Fred key whose value refers to the value 19. Now, importantly, and this is the thing that throws off a lot of students, I didn't have to initialize the Fred key. I didn't have to go to the object and say, make a Fred key and then put a 19 next to it. What I'm doing is I'm assigning the value 19, and I'm saying it's going to have this key Fred, and the fact that there was or was not a previous value associated with the Fred key doesn't matter. Effectively, you can assign a value to any key of any object at any time you want. There's nothing to stop. You don't have to preload it. You don't have to pre-initialize it. You don't have to declare it ahead of the way. You don't have to make sure there's a Fred value up here when you first declare the object. You can say, I want to add a new key to an object. You just assign a value to that key by using your equal symbol to assign and using your bracket notation to get to it. And that's it. That's all you have to do. It's not more complicated than that. Often it feels for a lot of people that they need to go ahead and like make a spot for us to put that number in. You don't have to. JavaScript will expand objects. It adds more pieces. If you say put in a new value with a new label on it, drop it into the bucket, just put it back into the object, and you'll be good to go. It all works perfectly fine. Okay, so for some practice, if you're watching at home and you want to take a moment to try out the muscle memory and make sure you're able to type this stuff out. So for practice, try making an object called daily sleep. Give it 2 values, right? One that's a string Monday that's been labeled by the day key. One that's a number for how many hours you got sleep last night, labeled by the hour slept key. And then you can define a separate variable, how much sleep, and assign the value of daily sleep's hour slept key to that variable in order to make sure you can access things correctly. And if you want to have a lot of fun, try making an array of these objects to represent how much sleep you had all night or all week. And again, you're welcome to pause the video and work on this on your own to make sure you have a chance to make sure it all works. Okay, so as I said, we can access values inside of objects by using bracket notation. The values in an object are called properties. So you'll often hear us interchangeably talk about a value of an object or the property of an object. Properties are going to get used more often. You're going to hear that word more and more and more and more and more as we talk through as we work through JavaScript. So we can access the properties of an object by using bracket notation. So here's some extended example. So here's an object that represents a person. So this is less of a collection of values like we've seen before, and this is more of an object representing like a person, like a particular data with maybe a bunch of different values or parts to that. More similar to the kind of objects and classes you might have worked with in Java or Python. So here's my person object. My person has a first name key and a value Alice, a last name key and a value Wong, an age, a favorites key, which happens to refer to another object. Again, we can nest these things together, just like we talked about nested arrays. And my favorites key object has a music key, a food key, and a numbers key, which is itself then an array. So I actually have an array inside of an object, inside of another object. Great. So we can access and work with these values from this particular object by using bracket notation. So I can say, let's get this person's name by going to person first name. That accesses the first name value. I assign it to a key name. I can go to the person last name and change it to Jones. Maybe they're going through a name change for some reason. Set the value of that last name. I can access both these pieces and combine them together, right? I can say, get me the person's first name and the person's last name, concatenate them together, and that gives me Alice Jones. I can use variables inside of brackets with an object. So just like with arrays that you've probably done this in Java, right? If you have like my array, you've probably accessed like the ith index, the value at index I, right? Where this I is a variable. Probably you may have done like I plus 1, where you've actually done you've done expressions that go inside the brackets. The exact same thing can happen with objects. We're using the same bracket notation. So what I can do is I can actually say, for example, in this example, I can say go to my ages object, and I can say get me the value that's at for free plus ed, right? I can write an expression that says which name I want to get. I can make a variable, which is going to be which name I want to get. And then if I say get the value at that name, and also check it out, this should give me the 19 for Fred. So again, we're allowed to have variables in there, right? That variable can be which name, it can be some user input, it could be I plus 1. I mean, don't do that because you're not going to be using indexes. But you can do the exact same thing with variables that you would use with objects that you'd use with arrays. I'm going to put the which name thing here. Great. So we can do that. For example, then I can go to my person's, maybe I'm asking the user, say, which favorite do you want to look up? And they say, I want to look up food. So then I can have my code go to person's favorites, and then in that object, go to the food key, right? Because food is what the chosen value actually is. When JavaScript's evaluating this, it says it takes the chosen value, replaces it with the word food, and that's the key it then goes to. Similarly, I can string together my brackets, person's favorites, numbers 0, give me my 0th number that is my favorite from my person. I can add new values to my favorite numbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. This is, again, our basic way we can take an object, we can access values, we can manipulate the values, we can work with those values as we need to. This isn't the only syntax for accessing values. In fact, not even the most common syntax. It's just the one that's most familiar from what we've seen before. JavaScript also supports using dot notation for accessing values and properties and objects. This is the similar ways you've accessed attributes or variables from classes. If you've done class level work, object-oriented work, it's similar in concept to the $ in R. We're working with lists in R, right? So rather than trying to write out like the double brackets to access values, you just write out a $. Same idea here, exact same kind of behaviors. So I'm taking the exact same code and I can rewrite it by using dot notation. So I have my person, same person, right? Nothing's changed. In order to access the person's name, I can, instead of using person bracket quote first name, I could put person dot first name. The dot is really, it's kind of like an apostrophe S, like the possessive in English. So this is person's first name. That gets the value of my first name key. And I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate that it works. Together. So again, I'm going to get my person's first name key. We'll console log out that person's first name key. We'll just console log and see if you can see that it works. Right? There's Alice. That's my person's first name key. Now, this is exactly equivalent to me saying in brackets, access the first name key in quotes. Alice. Note that I can't ignore the quotes. I can omit quotes when I'm declaring objects, but not when I'm accessing their keys. If I try to say access the first name key of a person, I'm going to get an error because it's looking for this to be a variable, and there is no variable called first name. It's like saying, give me the ith key entry from an array, but I've never defined what I is. In this case, I've never defined what first name is. Okay, so I replace that with a dot. Similar, I can talk about person's first name plus person's last name. Same code, I'm just replacing the brackets with dot notations. So dot notation tends to be a little bit easier to type. It's less typing, right? Less stuff to work. There's less punctuation you have to type. It tends to be a bit faster and easier to read. In practice, we use dot notation all the time. So whenever we're trying to access or refer to values of objects, we're going to do it by using dot notation. Bracket notation works. It's fine. Dot notation is the more idiomatic and effective way of actually doing that work. The one place you have to use brackets is if you do, in fact, want to use a variable in your labeling, right, in what you're trying to access. So if I've got Alice here, and I want to try to access person. Oh, God. Oh, stop. The autocomplete is really driving me crazy. I'm going to try to access person's favorites. We'll console log it so you can see what I'm looking for. So if I go to person's favorites, right? Oops, sorry. Right, my person's favorites is an object, music, food, numbers. And then I want to indicate which thing I want to get. I want to say I want to get their food, or no, I want to say which thing. And we'll make a variable here, right? Const which thing can be food, right? This is my user input. I said which index do I want to access effectively. If I say which thing, and I say get me what's their favorite food, the value I'm going to get here is undefined because what that's looking for is in my person's favorite things, it's looking for a key that is WHICHTHING. And I don't have such a key. I have a key music, food, and numbers. I don't have a key WHICHTHING. I don't have a which thing key. So if I want to use this as a variable, I have to do it using bracket notation. I have to say, be able to use sort of an index, use a special value here inside the brackets in order to access which thing I want to deal with. Oh my gosh, that was not what I wanted to hit. Hit refresh on this one. Then it can tell me which is my favorite thing, which is pizza. So if you ever realize you want to access a variable key in an object, and we do that occasionally, right? Say like maybe I'm getting user input on which value I want to get. From that, you would have to use bracket notation, but otherwise you can use dot notation for pretty much everything with objects. Arrays do not support dot notation. Arrays, you have to use brackets. So you can't talk about array dot 3. You have to use brackets there. So I know that can get confusing because now you've got two different kinds of syntaxes, but if you really think dot notation is for objects, brackets are for arrays, that'll get you pretty far on where you need to go. This is the most common way to write and work with objects, right? We write out object literals without quotes around the keys, and we're going to access those values by using dot notation. That's the idiomatic standard way of writing JavaScript. That's what you will see and use throughout for the rest of the class, basically. It's fine if you want to, as you're learning, practice by using bracket notation for accessing things. That's okay. It's not going to break anything. It'll work fine. It's just not as idiomatic, and you're going to you want to practice and learn using dot notation because that's where you actually looks like you know what you're doing when you're writing JavaScript. Okay, cool. Yep, no variables allowed in that syntax. Okay, the last thing I want to note with objects and arrays and data structures is that if we want to create data tables, right, I want to create like sets of data, and in informatics, we're often really interested in making data tables and working with large sets of data. We do that in JavaScript by using arrays of objects, where all those objects have the same set of properties, and those properties represent then the features of those values in our data table. So unlike in R, where we thought of data tables or data frames as lists of columns, In JavaScript, similar to what we might do in Java or Python, we're going to think of data tables as arrays or lists of objects or of records. So in this case, each row, each record, each object has its set of properties, right? I have a name, I have a height, I have a weight, name, height, weight for all of them. And because all of these objects have the same set of properties, we can think about them as being as like a table, where I can say now go to any row, any entry in people, right? So I could say if I have my people here, this is my people. I'm going to write people array because it's an array. You got to be very careful that, again, so an object, it's an array of objects. I could say go to my people array, go to the 1th element, the Bob element, right? And then I can say get the name of what's the name of the value at the 1th element, right? Go to index 1, get the name property from that. And that tells me that that person is Bob. I could say how tall is the person at the 1th element? Bob's height is 74. So we can use this to access individual pieces or aspects of our data table if we want to be able to work through that data. Similarly, because it's an array, we can loop through it. We'll talk about loops in the next video in order to be able to sort of access all these various pieces as we go. Okay, that's the basic. Those are the two big basic data structures in JavaScript: is arrays and objects. They often get combined. We'll have arrays of objects. We'll have objects that include arrays. We have objects of objects. We have arrays of arrays. We nest these data structures very thoroughly. So things to remember, right, is distinct from other languages. We use literals, right? We sort of just write out the literal. We write out the contents of an array directly. We access them using brackets or dot notations, and then we can assign new values to them whenever we need to. You don't need to sort of pre-include or initialize some values. You can just add new pieces into your arrays or into your objects as needed, as things need to grow or change or adjust in size. Great. Yeah, and that's the basic set of data structures that we'll need to work with in JavaScript.